an issue that's quite close to my heart, and something I've been involved in only very recently, but it's been quite a journey already. So just to welcome our three speakers, we've got Professor Merle Sowman, we've got Mr. Nico Waldeck, and we've got Odette Geldenhuys, and I'll give them each a bit more of an intro as we go. It's obviously huge gratitude from the Environmental Law Association for their time that they've given to us this evening. And I know that everyone here will be able to draw so much from what is going to be on offer. But just quickly, just to set the scene, I'm Patrick Forbes. I'm a member of the Environmental Law Association. I sit on its executive committee as a KZN representative, a very wet KZN, I might add, at the moment. And the ELA is an association that has many facets, but the main drive and the aim is to really focus on the environmental rights enshrined in our constitution and the development of that right. And one of the avenues that we use is these screening clubs to pick topical issues that have been put into a documentary type of a format and get people to speak on them. And the film that I'm sure you've all watched and no doubt enjoyed, Ours Not Mine, was the idea of an organization called Protect the West Coast, who I've been assisting with from a legal perspective as an attorney myself. And Protect the West Coast is an organization of individuals who've just identified that the West Coast is under significant pressure from a number of angles, one of which is mining, and really want to bring awareness to this area. And one of the avenues that they utilized was they secured some funding from an overseas donor to put together the film, and which was produced and directed by Brian Little and Ana Felipe Dominguez. And I think you'll share my sentiment in what that film is, which is just an epic bit of cinematography, and which really captures, I think, the very real and personal stories that are on the West Coast, which I think are often lost in the politics of mining in general, and the noise around that. But putting all of that aside, and who I am, I'm certainly not the star of the show. I want to get on with the speakers as soon as possible. And what we're hoping to do is give each of the speakers 10 or 15 minutes to chat about the issues that are close to their heart and which they feel are important in this context and in this discussion. And then we'll hop from one to the other. And I would ask everyone, please put questions, issues in the chat box. We can talk about them later. One of the things that I would really like to do is set aside enough time at the end that we can really have an interactive discussion. I think a lot of what's going on the West Coast is out of sight and out of mind. I think there are a lot of issues that could take us a week of nights like this to canvass. But I think if we can tease out some of the more critical issues and have a discussion around them, very selfishly, personally, it can help me to help protect the West Coast, dealing with these issues. But I'm sure Merle, Nico, and Odette, who've been integrally involved in the West Coast dynamic, would love to answer your questions and perhaps receive your input, and perhaps some ideas and perspectives can be shared. On that note, over to you, Merle. But before you start, just a quick introduction from me. Merle should need no introduction. She was a star in the film, as you will have seen. But she's also a host of other things as well. One of which in the academic space is a professor at UCT in the Environmental and Geological Sciences department. But I think where Merle's focus has been is in integrative coastal fisheries management, and particularly on the West Coast. And I mean, it doesn't stretch in so far as South Africa's boundaries, but goes much further north than that, in collaboration with Namibian fisheries and then Angola, but with a focus on the communities, the socio and economic dynamics up there. So Merle, please, can I hand over to you? I'm sorry if I've missed out anything on your CV. It's so long, we could be here for a while, but we look forward to hearing from you, and thank you again.
Thanks, Patrick, and thank you for inviting me to give this presentation or to participate in this panel. So I'm going to try and share my screen, which is always sort of a risky business. How's that? Can you see it?
Yes, Merle, we've got it. Great.
Okay, so let's see if I can make it nice and big. How's that?
Perfect, Merle, we can see it. That's fantastic.
All right. Yeah, so what I'm going to be sharing with you this evening is just some, my perspectives of what I consider to be some of the key issues, impacts, and what action is needed in the light of this increasing mining threat to the West Coast. So what I'll do is I'll really just give a quick overview of this rapid increase in prospecting and mining applications that we're seeing, and highlight some of the key issues, and in particular concerns around the failure, or what I consider to be the failure of the One Environmental System, and what action we need. So what we're seeing on the West Coast, and have been seeing for the last 2 to 3 years, is a rapid increase in prospecting and mining applications, but also for oil and gas exploration in marine waters. But I'm not going to focus on that so much. I'm going to focus mainly on the coastal, that interface between land and sea. And so what we're seeing is a lot of applications for heavy mineral sands, for diamonds and other gemstones, and also some applications for phosphate mining. In the sea space, you probably are all very aware of the applications for seismic surveys with respect to oil and gas, and there have also been various applications for the exploration and the production of oil and gas. So as I said, we've seen this rapid increase in these number of applications and environmental authorizations, and the actual mining, prospecting and mining processes have begun. And in particular, I think the fact that several of the concessions lapsed at the end of 2020, we've seen a sort of a sudden push in many applicants applying for these rights once again. Of course, the big issue is that there is no central database. There's no portal of where all these applications are located. So the public really don't know what the status is of these many different applications. And interestingly enough, government themselves don't seem to have the big picture, because I've made presentations to the local municipalities, to the provincial departments, and even at national level. And I think people have been quite surprised when they've seen the maps that I'm going to share with you. And so because of this lack of information, a small research group that I'm involved in in the Environmental and Geographical Science Department, the One Ocean Hub, we've begun to monitor, to document and map these various applications and their status. So what you're seeing here is what I'm calling the state of knowledge. In other words, what we know so far, and there could be some gaps. And this is a sort of a zoomed out map, which really includes that seismic survey area, that big marine space. But this really zooms into that coastal area. And what we see there is the almost wall-to-wall applications from in the north at Alexander Bay, all the way down to almost to Lamberts Bay now. So we're seeing the applications moving south, and except for a small area in the proximity of the Groenspoeg River, where you see very little red or pink, the rest of the coast is basically either under prospecting, it's either under application, it's been approved, or mining. So mining is where you see the dark red areas. The same is happening on land. And this is a map that's been produced, I think, by the Department of Environment Affairs and Development Planning, but I'm not going to go into that. We're focusing here on the coastal environment. So I think those of you who know the West Coast, and as Patrick said, it's kind of, for many, it's sort of remote, and perhaps people don't visit these more remote areas, but the West Coast economy is basically underpinned by its natural resources, whether it's for recreational and tourism, nature-based tourism in particular, which is growing, or for agriculture and fisheries. So basically, many coastal fishing communities rely on the coastal zone and on the marine space for their food and their livelihoods. So let's have a look at some of the mining that's taking place in this marine and coastal environment. So Tronox at Namakwa Sands is perhaps one of the largest operations that is currently under mining for heavy mineral sand. You can see the boundaries of the area in that red, the red bounded area. There's a green area all along that coastal zone. You'll see the green bounded area, which was a so-called setback area. But then in 28, so the photograph on the right, you see the Namakwa Sands, the tailings in the far, further on, and then in the near, in sort of closer, you can see this more pristine coastal environment. And that's not to say this entire coastal zone is pristine. It certainly isn't. There's a lot of off-road vehicle damage that has been caused, and there's a lot of ad hoc recreational and tourism activities. But there are large parts of this coastal area that are, very much pristine. But the point I wanted to make here is that whilst there was an area set aside, once the mining started at Namakwa Sands, there was an application to allow prospecting in the coastal setback area, and that was approved. Another big mining operation is the MSR Torman mining project. And this is the actual Torman sort of infrastructure area where some of the processing takes place. It's located about 20 kilometers north of the Olifants estuary. What we've witnessed over time since it began in about 2014 is that there have been various cliff collapses in the vicinity of the Torman mine, both north and south of it. And here you can see how efforts to rehabilitate and to rehabilitate those collapsed cliffs have taken place. And you can see some of the dams at the base of those cliffs. So this just gives you an idea of what's happening along that particular stretch of coast, which is, which contains a lot of coastal cliffs. Here you can see again another piece of cliff that has washed away or broken off. And what we're seeing, and with this mining, what happens is that there's excavation of these beaches, the profile of the beach drops down, and the possibility exists that with the wave run-up, there's undercutting of the cliffs and the cliffs collapse. This is contested, and the mining companies don't agree that this is happening. They argue that these are natural processes, and even though we've seen nearly 8 cliff collapses on the area between, in the area where this mining has taken place, we don't have confirmation that in fact it is the mining that has led to these cliff collapses, although our geologists that are working on this and geomorphologists seem to think that that is the case. Other concerns are things like, the fine muds from the terrestrial environment washing into the near shore and potentially smothering marine organisms. Of course, it's an important crayfish area. It's an important spawning area. Concerns on impact of biodiversity in the coastal terrestrial vegetation and loss of access to the coast. Now, Torman or MSR, which is operated by Torman in South Africa, have got plans to expand the mining of heavy mineral sands from the area just north of the Olifants estuary all the way to the end of that red line, which is at a place called Lamberts Bay, which is just south of the Tronox mine. So what you see there is the area that is currently mined, which is in red, and then you see other areas shaded in sort of mauve and green, which are areas that are either under prospecting or have got prospecting rights. What is interesting is that this information has been presented in their annual reports for their shareholders, and so they clearly have a vision for what is intended for that almost 60-kilometer stretch of coast and estuarine area. So the current extension of the Torman mine, which is subject of a legal case at the moment, is it extends from the north bank of the Olifants to south of Lamberts Bay. It's an area of about 52 k's, and then it includes estuarine frontage of about 11 kilometers. The big issue is that each of these MSR applications are being assessed and considered and approved on an ad hoc basis. And what we see is that MSR has a plan for that entire region, but we don't have a plan. We have no environmental management framework in place. There's been no strategic environmental assessment, and our government is assessing each application on an ad hoc basis. So just to give you some visuals of the expansion that has been approved and that is currently underway. So this is north of the Olifants estuary. You can see the expansion into the inland strandline mining area. You can see the expansion onto the 10 beaches moving north, and the kind of mining that's taking place, this heavy mineral sand mining. Here on this particular beach, beach 10, you're getting processing taking place on the beach, and then it's trucked to the Torman main mine area. So just to get back to this map, basically what some of those photos that I've shown you is essentially what could be happening on our beaches and on our coastal land and in the near shore in the coming years. We already have mining, intense mining taking place in those very dark red areas and in the more pinky sort of red areas, we have prospecting that has been approved. And of course, once prospecting is approved, it's likely that if the prospecting is successful and the yields are good, that there will be a mining application and mining will be improved. And I think the issue is that once government has indicated support for prospecting, they're indicating to the company, to the client, that, or the applicant, that mining is as a land use is potentially is going to be acceptable. So what are some of the issues and impacts? Well, of course, we're concerned about a whole range of issues, from marine ecosystem impacts through to loss of public access, heritage value, loss of heritage value, increase in traffic and congestion, and damage to roads, air quality, and so forth. And in particular on the West Coast, of course, concerns about scarce water resources. What we know with EIAs is, whilst mitigation is usually presented in the environmental management plan, it is very often not implemented judiciously. The other concern is that cumulative issues of these various applications are not being adequately assessed. So with respect to the mitigation measures, we find that often they're not feasible and they're not implemented judiciously. There's not the proper monitoring by DMRE, and in some cases, there's a lack of compliance with the requirements of the EMPR. A major concern is failure to properly consider the cumulative impacts. So whilst the project level environmental impact assessment requires the environmental assessment professionals to consider cumulative impacts in their EIA process, or even in the basic assessment report, what we're finding is that EAPs are not looking at this in the fullest extent as required by the law and as required by South Africa's definition of what a cumulative impact is, which is not only about present applications, but it's also about past and future planned applications. And what we find when EAPs are challenged on this is they often say, well, we don't know what the status of the planned projects are, or, don't worry about prospecting, it causes limited damage, so, we don't have to be too concerned. So what we really need most urgently is a strategic level cumulative impact assessment, which really gives us a sense in an area like that MSR area, which is a 60-kilometer stretch of coast. We need to understand, if all of those applications are approved, what will be the impact on scarce water resources? What is the extent of loss of biodiversity? Maybe linked to one mine, loss of critical biodiversity can be overlooked. But when we start adding all of this up, when we look at the loss of the scenic quality of that coast, given that is an important recreational and tourism area, when we begin to add up all the trucks, all the dust, the impact on the roads, the congestion when they get to the Saldanha Bay port, for example, these are critical issues which really need to guide decision-making. And I believe cumulative impacts are not being assessed either at a project level and certainly not at an overall regional level. So my main concerns, and I'll just have these two slides then, is that each application is being assessed on an ad hoc basis and that decisions are being made without a full understanding of these cumulative impacts. And so sustainability is not really underpinning the decision-making process. The fact that DMR is the decision-making authority, but they also have the mandate for the exploitation, the extraction, and the development of our mineral resources. And what we're noticing is that the appeals that are heard by the Minister of Environment are often not getting her attention, in that largely we find that these appeals are being dismissed and that environmental authorization is supported. And so we're seeing prospecting and mining happening in critical biodiversity areas, in areas that are very important for fishing, for coastal communities, and so on. Critically important is that coastal communities are not being properly consulted. And we see that the government themselves lack resources and capacity to be responding and commenting to the slew of applications that are coming across their desks. They just basically can't cope. And most concerning is we have no overarching environmental framework or strategic environmental framework to guide decisions. So as I've said, civil society, government, researchers, we just can't keep pace with what's going on. And so what's happening is civil society is resorting to legal action to challenge these applications and decisions. And so in conclusion, some of the thoughts I'd like to leave you with is that Clearly, the one environmental system is deeply problematic. It's certainly not protecting environmental rights. It's not ensuring security of livelihoods and addressing basic needs of communities. As I've said, there's been no proper assessment of the cumulative effects of all these different prospecting and mining applications. And we certainly need to really be pushing government to undertake or commission an independent strategic environmental assessment before any further approvals are granted on the West Coast. I mean, interestingly enough, we have legislation and we have a tool, the Marine Spatial Plan, which is supposed to be developed prior to making all these decisions. Yet the Marine Spatial Plan is in its infancy, and yet we're making all these decisions about the marine space to allow developments, but we don't, again, have a plan in place for the marine waters. And certainly, we need more robust and meaningful public participation and better collaboration between government, civil society, and researchers. Okay, I think that's it from me. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Merle. Right, so Merle has painted a picture of what can only be described as doom and gloom. I mean, it's very evident, Merle, from the maps that you've showed that there's an avalanche of prospecting applications and mining applications that the West Coast is facing. And that's not just the coastline, as you'd identified, although we'd focused on that, but it's inland and offshore. And yeah, we don't need to labor the issues around the DMRE and the failure of oversight, which, as you've identified, is critical, as well as the seemingly vacuous way in which these decisions are being made. As whilst the applications come flying in thick and fast, it's difficult to get the DMRE to respond to civil society organizations, but they're very quick to, or apparently very quick to, stamp approvals for these applications coming through. But we can discuss, and I'm sure there'll be quite a bit of feedback and questions coming your way. Let's shift the focus a little bit now to Nico. Just to give you a brief introduction, Nico, and please bear with me if I don't do you justice. Nico was born and bred in Lamberts Bay. He's the son of a fisher. His grandfather was a fisherman. I think he said it himself in the movie that that fishing is his life. And when I chatted to Nico before tonight, as one does to try and introduce people, which is always, at least for me, quite awkward, trying to do somebody the justice that they deserve, he said, Pat, it's not about me. It's about the fishing folk on the West Coast. I am because they are. And I just sort of paused for a moment and thought, sure, okay. But watching the film, Nico, and your participation up there, if it's not inspiring, then I don't know. And Nick's also a co-founder of Aberlobi. Have a look at aberlobi.org. It's a fantastic network of local fishing folk who are really trying to upskill and empower themselves to participate in that fisheries resource in the best possible way they can. And anyone who hasn't had their head buried in the sand will know that the rights relating to fishing on the West Coast have been fraught, and Nico's at the center of all of that. Nico, I'll hand over to you, please, to give us a real on the ground, boots in the trenches feel for what it is to live and work and be a part of the West Coast community.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Sure, Merle has painted a very dark picture for us. But if we translate, what she is saying into our indigenous language, it simply means it's the beginning of the end of the road of our livelihoods. It's simple as that. There's also this thing what we've experienced over many years now, from generation to generation. This is just another form of exclusion from our livelihoods. We have experienced these things, or our grandfathers and their parents have experienced these things during apartheid. Lately, we have experienced it ourselves with the new democracy. And now we experience it again with mining rights. The question for me is, how long should we and could we tolerate this kind of attack on our livelihoods? So fishing for us is a big thing. I'm from the view that when nobody have, you how could you say, nobody have, when nobody if it's just it's difficult. If I made arrangements for us, man, you know, it's the nature, it's the sea that have welcomed us when there was no jobs in fishing communities. You know, after matric myself, I've become a fisher because that's what I know. And the sea was a kind of our safety net, our comfort, you know, and I believe that this will be for generations to come. Because if I look at the youngsters in my community, in the fishing communities, you know, they go to school to a certain level, and then they, you know, most of them becoming fishers. So the question now is, would in my lifetime, would I witness, you know, the closure, the end of our livelihoods as fishing communities? And then there's a follow-up question. So what will happen to the next generation if we allow these things to happen? There's also the issue of trust with the scientific community, you know. And one question I always have is, and I must say, or ask for forgiveness for scientists like Professor Merle Sowman, Dr. Shurz Ramakas, Dr. Jackie Zunde, which have stand by our side, you know, although it's an uphill fight. But in general, where were those scientists when we were excluded from our rights? Where were their voices? You know, we as poor fishing communities have always to take government to court. You have to take mining to court, you know. But these voices over the years, sure, I'm not attacking people, but that's the reality for us as fisher folk. Why were they silent all over those years? Why they are now, you know, so loud when we are really under attack, you know, because of mining? But we were under attack, you know, all the years. We were under attack just to put food on the table, you know. So this thing about, could we trust people that help us or want to help us, you know, in terms of scientists? It's I'm struggling with it. I'm really struggling with it, you know. So what does the future hold for us as fishing communities? And I'm starting witness not only the end of our livelihoods as things are fast-tracked by driven role players. I also see now that fishers, you know, and that's the saddest part for me, that especially some of the young fishers have lost the respect and the love for the ocean. Because, you know, why do we have to protect something that in future that doesn't belong to our children? And that's something we really struggle with. It's a sad part to witness, but it's a reality. So I can give you some examples. You know, when people apply for fishing rights, you know, that's a smooth process because it's commercial, it's industrial. But when we're talking about implementation of a thing that's close to us, the small scale policy, we're talking about years, and still it's not being implemented. We can't see it for being implemented in the next 5 years, you know, but every 5 or 10 years, there's a new fishing rights application process and people receiving rights. And we are still seen as interim relief fishers. So that's a huge burden in planning for the future. Many fishers have passed away without their fishing rights, without the security of my family will be covered when I'm not there. If you're going to the commercial side, in other sides of the fishing, that's been guaranteed. Their children have a future. Our children haven't got. So that's one of the examples. The other example is it's very close to us. It's about elephants. The river. When I still remember when they started with this thing that they call the estuary management plan. They've come to us and explained to us in love why we need to stop fishing so that fish for the future could be protected for the next generation. And they've explained to us for how many kilometers we are not allowed to fish. Hundreds of fisher families are not allowed to fish anymore, right? Fast forward that management plan is still not implemented. They are in the final phases now. But fast forward this, you see the consultants, which are environmental people, scientific, from the scientific community. They are kind of the people that introduce now the application of the mining. So in our heads, in our indigenous heads, we don't understand. You explain to us, we are not allowed to fish here because we need to protect that area, for the next generation. But then you come now and you do as environmental consultants, then apply for mining application, in the kind of the same area. So, 1 + 1 isn't it 2, or maybe in your case it's 3, because you are a special group of people, So and that contributes to the trust between the scientific community and us as indigenous community. The other example, and it's not only in Olifants or in my area. The other example is this one in near Anaston, where our people are staying, what they call the Web. That's a kind of marine protected area or nature reserve. Our fishers are not allowed to fish inside there, but the Nyala are there in operation. They're testing some stuff there. So how do you explain to us, indigenous people, that no, you can't fish there, but we're going to test the bombs there? It doesn't make sense. So the point here for me is, with all those challenges, mining is just another one on top of those that we are knowing. But I've seen over the years that our fishers finding comfort in this, in the way that people are labeled them. They are informal, they are nobodies, and they have managed to survive as nobodies. And that's why you struggle, if you get some data of these guys, they want to be informal, they want nobody, because they find comfort in it, in most of them, or most of us, we are looking at a sea. We want the sea still, it's our heritage. It's something that belongs to us. It's something that we want to protect. But some of us are feeling weak, and we've in Afrikaans we say, "You gooi die hand in." It's too much. How long could we appeal and in court whilst we are struggling just to put food on the table? That's our story. Mining is just one that is, mining in our eyes is just an add-on. But if you unpack it, it really is the end of fishing as our livelihoods. So Patrick, that's enough for me from now.
You're not off the hook just yet, Nico. Maybe enough for now. But Nico, thank you. I think we need to stop there for a moment and recognize that story and that point of view, which is unfortunately not part of the conversation enough in relation to our natural resources, in relation to mining, in relation to fisheries. And it really is an honor to hear from you and to get that perspective. What I take away from it is a deep sense of connection with the place itself in terms of your identity and your heritage, and knowing that the livelihood that you've enjoyed and that you would want future generations to enjoy is under significant threat. And that's deeply concerning. I can only imagine that must be incredibly demotivating. But certainly the resilience that you've shown and that the fisheries communities up there have shown is immeasurable. Especially when, as you say, Nico, mining is just an add-on. This is the end of a sentence that's a very long sentence, and the challenges have been numerous. And now this is another add-on right on top that I certainly hope won't be the proverbial straw that breaks the camel's back. But it is absolutely fascinating to get those insights from someone who's been on that stretch of land for generations. Nico, we certainly will have some more input from you in a bit, I hope. I'm just going to jump across to Odette now, Odette, also, you should need no introduction. Odette's based at Webber Wentzel down in Cape Town. She's I'd be interested to hear about that foray. But I'll hand over to you now to give us an indication of some of the legal implications that you've dealt with up on the West Coast and how that informs the narrative in the film, but also your view on the West Coast and the communities up there and the challenges that they are facing. Thank you so much for your time.
Ek wil net begin om te baie dankie te sê vir jou, Nico. En toe jy daai ding sê van die jong mense wat nou respek verloor vir die see, dit was baie pynvol toe jy dit gesê het. So ja, ek dink ons moet nog baie praat. I think, Patrick, what you also don't know about me is that I actually grew up in Vredendal, which is 10-15 kilometers from Tormans Mine. It's very close to where Nico lives in Lamberts Bay, and it's also very close to where the Ebenezer community live. And the Ebenezer community has been my client for a number of years. So when Mo and Nico said, you know, do people even know where's the West Coast and what happens there? I'm just going to give you some of the names. Papendorp, Lutzville, Koekenaap, Strandfontein, Lamberts Bay, Doring Bay, if any of those names, you've heard any of those names, then you're an insider, then you know the West Coast. So the Ebenezer community stretch almost right to the sea. They along the Olifants Rivier. If you just bear in mind one of the maps that Mo put up, and the Ebenezer community is about 3. There was one issue, and that is that the Ebenezer community had lived there over many decades. Initially had been a transient community, but as things changed, they became settled in that area. And so, as we did with apartheid, we passed laws. And so a law was passed in 1926, which transferred the land away from the Ebenezer community to the state to run this this irrigation scheme, and white people were settled there, and over time they became farmers, and over time they became successful farmers, but especially in grapes for winemaking, but also cash crops, tomatoes, potatoes, onions, lucerne. Those were the main cash crops. And so in 1996, when the land restitution process opened for people to put in land claims, the community put in a land claim. And not dissimilar with many other land claims communities, it took the Ebenezer community from 1996 to 2020 to have their land claim resolved, and for government and the then landowners to come to an agreement that those landowners will make their farms available to be purchased by the state and to be transferred to the Ebenezer land claims, the Ebenezer Community Property Association. And that process is still underway. The process of, as I said, we reached that agreement in August 2020, and the process of transferring all the portions of land that should come to the Communal Property Association, that's still in progress. And so not more than a year later, the Ebenezer community was faced with a prospecting application by a company called Boegeberg Resources. And to give you a sense of the extent of that application, while the total land ownership of the Ebenezer community is about 17,000 hectares, the prospecting application by Boegeberg Resources is over 11,000 of those hectares. And because of the way that our mineral rights regime have been structured post 1994, the land may belong to the community, the landowners, the Communal Property Association, but the minerals under that land belong to the state. So the theory goes for the state to distribute it in a more equal way than it had been in the past, when the land was owned primarily by white people, and then the mineral rights were owned by definition by white people. So now it's up to the DMRE to, in an equitable way, distribute those mineral resources. And the way that the legislation is set up, it almost has built into it this understanding that prospecting is just that. It's just, a entity wanting to just look around, just to see what there is. But we know that in order for a company, an entity, to put in a prospecting application, it must already know that there is something to find. They're not going to be sinking literally millions of rands into just looking around when they don't know that there's something to be found. So it's pretty automatic that after prospecting follows a mining application. So yeah, just to give you a sense of the Ebenezer community, as I said, about 3,000 adults. It's in a semi-remote part of the country that not many people know about. It's a part of the country where unemployment is rife, and so with mining and with prospecting comes this carrot of employment. And because the unemployment is so severe, just even it's like a chimera of employment, because even in Boegeberg's own prospecting application, they were honest and they said, you know what, we're not going to be creating jobs during prospecting, but people can't see that because they're so desperate for jobs that they think that there will be jobs, and so communities become quite keen to consider these kinds of apparent opportunities for job creation that gets presented to them. You know, and what Nico very clearly understands is that saying yes to a possibility of 5 or 10 or make it 300 jobs when mining eventually takes place means the loss of something completely different. It means the loss for Nico and his communities, some of who are also part of the Ebenezer community, of another form of income. It means the loss of a certain kind of lifestyle. And in terms of the Ebenezer community, they are just starting to explore farming on a commercial scale. There's also a part of the Ebenezer land which is not a big piece of land, but a wind farming company is looking at that piece of their property where, while it's a small portion of the land, the kind of income that will come from that will be passive income of a really substantial amount of rental that would then come to the Ebenezer Communal Property Association. Once again, Boegeberg was very honest in its application. It said, you know what, if our prospecting leads to mining, there will be no wind farm. And when I personally challenged the CEO of the Boegeberg Resources on this fact, he said to me, oh, we must have made a mistake. It can't be. I'm sure and we haven't had a letter of correction to that. So it was a very bizarre interaction. So just to tell you, when the Ebenezer community heard that the environmental authorization had been granted for their prospecting right, we could still lodge an appeal on behalf of the Ebenezer community, something which I'm just going to say now, and I'm going to just park for now because it's a proposal, but there's apparently a proposal that these appeals, which now can be brought by interested and affected parties who are farmers, fisher folk, people like the Ebenezer community, people like Professor Merle Sowman, might be done away with, and this appeal process may in the future only be open to experts, to environmental authorization practitioners, which we are complete. It will do away with community involvement. But the basis on which the Ebenezer community put in its appeal is firstly on the basis of proper consultation. Now, I had personally attended the consultation that Boegeberg Resources had with the Ebenezer community. They weren't given a chance to speak because the community was so upset about them coming there without an invitation that the meeting dissolved in a slanging match, and Boegeberg had to close its PowerPoint presentation, and it had to leave with its proverbial tail behind between its legs. Despite that, in its follow-up report to the departments, it said that it had successful community consultation. And so in our appeal, we said that if they'd had proper consultation, they would have heard and they would have understood about the land reform, the land restitution, how that is absolutely key to the Ebenezer community. They would also have heard what the prospective wind farm will mean to that community who is so impoverished, and jobs and cash income for ultimately for its farming operations is key. They would also have heard about the water scarcity. Living there, having read reports about the area, it's an area of drought. The farming, our clients, the farms that they took over in 2020 had really suffered during the drought of 2015 through to 2018, and you know, the Ebenezer farming project now has to really work triply as hard to make up for the damage that had been caused by the drought and the loss of water over those years. The Buchelberg resources prospecting application literally used the term climate change once, just to say that it wasn't something to be considered. Now, I mean, you know, how one in like today in 2021 and 2022 cannot take climate change into account when you do anything. Even when you're a lawyer, we're talking as a law firm, we're talking about what is our impact on climate change as a law firm. So when you're talking about prospecting, and you know how you cannot even have a sentence, let alone a paragraph or a page or 2 pages about it, is mind-boggling. And then what Merle also, Professor Sowman also touched on, is the cumulative impact of all these applications. So for the department to just grant an environmental authorization to Buchelberg over the Ebenezer land is mind-boggling, that they didn't look at that map that Merle had put up that showed you cannot, no minister, no government official can legally grant an environmental authorization without looking at the environmental the cumulative impact. So yeah, so that's you know, that's in terms of the Ebenezer community. And I, as a attorney, I just want to say one last thing. Professor Sowman mentioned, you know, that communities have to, and organizations like Center for Environmental Resources have to resort to legal challenges. Those legal challenges, they're not the answer. They are costly, even when they're done on a pro bono basis. They are time consuming. Unfortunately, we have both a Department of Mineral and Resources and Energy. We have a department, the EFF department, or as they like to call themselves, the FFE, but I think they're the EFF department. Fight each of these legal challenges as if the existence of those departments depend on it. One would expect them to be to come to these legal challenges and say, you know, at least say you have raised issues which we just haven't considered, but now that you've raised them, you've aired them, let's talk about them. But that has not been our experience at all. And also what litigation does is it does approach issues in a very siloed basis, because one goes to court on very specific legal issues, which, you know, in the broader conversation, they get lost. But in order to litigate, one has to have these very limited and proscribed legal issues. So, you know, yeah, I work as a pro bono attorney, but certainly, you know, when I look at these kinds of court cases, once again, my heart breaks, because it's not the answer. It's really what Professor Sowman said, you know, more community involvement, more discussion, broader involvement of folk like yourselves, which, you know, is a much better way to go. So yeah, I think that's it from me for now. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Odette. That's given us another angle in on the West Coast dynamic. That Ebenezer community issue is just absolutely heartbreaking to think that a community has waited as long as they did to have the land restituted, only to then have a prospecting application over their land. I mean, it just offends against every sense of justice that I think anyone could possibly have. And the fact that our law, as you say, makes provision and effectively allows that to happen, says to me that something's definitely wrong. And I know you'll be fighting the good fight there, but it will no doubt be fraught with many issues. But it'll have to unfold in the fullness of time, I suppose. But just look, I'd like to open it to the floor to everyone, please. I certainly don't want to hold the mic here any longer than I absolutely have to. You're probably bored stiff of me already. So if you've got any questions, we'd love you to come online and ask them directly. Alternatively, if you want to pop them in the chat box, and I know there've been a few sort of questions stroke comments that have been put in there as well. It'll be really great. I think I'd really like to have a sort of an interactive discussion. But perhaps in trying to sort of tie all the threads together here, perhaps Nico, I can come back to you if possible. I just wanted to ask, in relation to the communities that are up there, and you've obviously walked quite a way down the path with them, what is it that the communities really want? If you had to try and summarize that into sort of, I don't know, 3 or 4 bullet points, and I know it's never that easy, but what do the community want? And I mean, I've got ideas about what I think we need, and I'm sure Odette and Merle and all the rest of our participants do as well. But what does the community want to see change? And who do they want to see as the really active role players in this space, if there is going to be a change?
Sure.
Sorry to put you on the spot there, Nico.
Sure, no problem. I think the one thing that most of the fisher folks want is access rights, you know, and a right that could translate in them could provide for their families, you know, right, that include things that they be able to put in the catchment areas, you know. And when it comes to high value species, that they needs to be included in a portion, you know, that are sustainable, and they could make a living out of it. I think that will be important, and also to be recognized as a powerful player, you know, when it comes to the management and the distribution of resources.
Thanks, Nico. It's just interesting to hear you say that, especially the last bit, because the recent seismic survey cases that we've had, I'm sure you would have been aware of the one on the west, on the Wild Coast, and then on the one on the West Coast, and the judge in the judgment coming out against, I think that was Searcher on the West Coast, was incredibly scathing of the public participation process that was undertaken there, which effectively, and I don't want to try and quote it verbatim because I won't get it right, but effectively said that the entire process was designed to exclude the local fishing community, which I think speaks to exactly the issue you're raising here, which is that communities feel excluded as a default position. And that needs to change at a very fundamental level.
Yeah, it also mentioned about the plans they, as government, have in place, you know, to kind of neutralize the participation of communities.
Thanks, Nico. That's, yeah, it's an issue that I think is not going to be resolved overnight, certainly, but something to be put on the radar. And as I'd said, the Environmental Law Association has a significant number of members who are environmental assessment practitioners. And I think that sort of insight is very valuable in terms of that public participation process, which is obviously a critical part of the whole authorization process. But Merle, perhaps I can put you on the spot again, if you don't mind. Just another question for me. I know I'm stealing the mic at the moment. Please put hands up. I know Kate, who's assisting me, will just let me know if there's a hand, someone who wants to jump online. Merle, I just wanted to come back to the map and what is in effect 500 kilometers of coastline that is being applied for in one way, shape, or form. What you spoke about strategic environmental assessments. Where are we with that? Is there anything happening? Are there the right noises being made? Aren't there? With all these applications being pushed through what appears to be so quickly, is a strategic environmental assessment going to be too little, too late? Where is that process?
Or maybe Odette can come in with respect to the actual MSR case, which was supposed to be heard in the High Court a few weeks ago, but at the moment there are negotiations taking place between the legal team of CER, which is Odette's group, and then also DFFE and DMRE and MSR. But certainly the feedback we're getting is that DFFE is not that supportive of an SCA. And one of the big concerns I have is that I think DFFE has this idea that there's already a lot of coastal land and nearshore areas that have already been kind of allocated for prospecting and sort of in some respects, for mining. And so an SCA is not necessarily the appropriate tool. They do seem to be supportive of doing a cumulative impact assessment, certainly in that one area where MSR has got all its proposed plans for that entire sort of 50 to 60 kilometer coastline. But, in truth, we don't have a broad environmental planning framework to guide us. And unless we have some kind, and of course, determining the boundaries of the assessment area. I mean, all of that needs a lot of careful thought and discussion. But at the moment, unless we have something like that in the sea, the Marine Spatial Plan, and on land, a strategic environmental assessment or an environmental management framework, we're basically responding to each of these applications on an ad hoc basis. And so that, of course, is problematic, because it seems to me that a lot of government officials, and I think until quite recently, certainly DFFE and DMRE themselves weren't aware of the extent of mining that was taking place on the West Coast. So, so we haven't had, there have been letters written, certainly the Protect the West Coast has written a letter, and others have raised in many of the appeals the need for a strategic environmental assessment. But DFFE at this stage has not responded positively to that. But I don't know, Odette, maybe you could add to that.
Odette, would you like to? Yeah, Odette, would you like to jump in there?
Sure. While the settlement talks are going on between the Centre for Environmental Rights and these two government departments, I can't really speak about the specifics of that, but just to say, I think what I said earlier on, but just to re-emphasize, is that certainly what one does get a sense, and that is to sort of reiterate what Merle said, is there's a lack of an overall framework, there's a lack of vision, and there's certainly a lack of urgency. It's and whether it's because the officials think that all the land on the West Coast has already been assigned to either prospecting or mining. But even if that is the case, then that's an even greater reason for greater urgency. But it's and it's kind of like the private sector Boegeberg not speaking about climate change. It's just a complete lack of like sort of parallel universes where we live. and where they live. It's like two different places.
If I could just add something else, I mean, I don't know to what extent people in the room are aware of DFFE's Ocean Economy Master Plan. So they have just submitted an Ocean Economy Master Plan to the Minister. And what is just mind-blowing is that in terms of the sectors that are in that plan, mining is not included as a sector. So here's the master plan for our ocean, which includes oil and gas as a growth area, and it includes aquaculture, mariculture, it includes shipping and marine transport and so on, and fisheries. But mining is excluded, and yet mining is probably, in terms of the space and the potential impact, is potentially going to be, well, on the coast that we're talking about, from Orange River down to Lamberts Bay, for the moment. We don't know how far south and how much further inland it's going to be. But yeah, certainly it's just unbelievable that such an important sector has just been excluded from that master plan.
Yeah, it speaks to the parallel universes, doesn't it? Well, it really does. I think you've hit the nail on the head there. There was an article today, the DG at the DMRE has stepped aside, Advocate Thabo Mokoena, and the article was just absolutely ruthless in relation to commentary on the DMRE and its complete dysfunctionality. And this has done, unfortunately, the country and the local community such a disservice. I mean, just as one tiny slither of this enormous pie. Certainly the fact that they haven't got their house in order. There was just one question that had been raised by Adi. I just wanted to put it to the floor. I'm not sure that I have an answer for it. Just asking about coastal setbacks and whether those have been approved for the West Coast in terms of the Integrated Coastal Management Act. Well, no. Is that okay?
Yeah, so I mean, those coastal management plans are now called management lines, coastal management lines. I mean, a lot of them, when they started doing that work, like at Pearly Beach, at Pringle Bay and those areas, I mean, there was a lot of opposition from landowners because of the potential implications, I guess, on land prices. So anyway, they're now called coastal management lines. But my understanding is from Marlene LaRosse, who's at DEDP, is that they've been delineated, but they haven't been through the public participation process, and they certainly haven't been endorsed by the MEC. The question is, even if they were there, would they be honored? Certainly what we've seen up at the Tronox area, where there was an area called a coastal setback as part of that, what appeared to me to be a sort of an agreement for the area that was now allocated for prospecting and mining, that area was then applied for prospecting. And although obviously certain areas within that were deemed inappropriate for any even prospecting because they were sensitive, prospecting has been allowed in that coastal setback area. So I think unless regulations are, unless they're integrated into the zoning plans and the regulations accompany that, I don't really think they're going to have much teeth.
No, agreed, Merle. And we've also seen in some of the authorizations that are granted, they do speak to a setback in relation to, for example, the toe of the dune and mining on the beaches. But we also know that that's not respected either, and not enforced. So it really is, and they don't call it the Wild West up there for nothing. It really has been a law unto itself. Odette, perhaps you can just, and I know I'm stealing more of the limelight, speaking about the recent withdrawal of the landowner's consent issue in relation to mining and prospecting, and specifically speaking to the Ebenezer community, whereas perhaps their consent would have been required, but now it isn't.
Yeah, Patrick, I think it is still but I'm not sure, but I think it's still what is required is that once there's a prospecting right has been granted, the landowner needs to enter into an agreement to traverse the land. So at that point, the landowner can not agree to traverse the land. But at that point, the mining company has got its prospecting right. And if it goes to any court anywhere in South Africa and says, we've got this right to prospect, here we've got these sort of recalcitrant people who just don't want to open their gate, we know what's going to happen. So in conversations with, or in the fake, or not fake, but the incomplete presentation by Buchelberg Resources, they held that up to the community and said, but you have a right to stop us from coming. But it's very hard for the community to understand. It will be this prospecting right versus the right to say yes or no, to kind of to drive over the land, and where the court will have to find for the prospecting right. And in the conversation that we had with the CEO, that was once again just given, put on the table to the community as, without, and then they put it in the terms of consent. We can't prospect, but it's at that stage it's too late. It's a fiction. Yes, it's the parallel universe again.
Yeah, it really is. It speaks to that exclusion issue.
Yeah. And it's, and it's only when one gets to mining where the community can start speaking of, some sort of, maybe, charge a fee for traversing the land. But certainly it's nothing like that in the prospecting phase.
Well, I see you had your hand up there for a second.
Well, if Odette's finished on this topic, I picked up something on the chat I thought we should respond to.
Please do, Merle.
Yeah, so I noticed, so Sue George made this point about how difficult it is to do a cumulative impact assessment at the sort of project level. And I mean, that's absolutely true, because often not all the information is available. But I think at the very least, it's incumbent on EAPS to put down what they know. And certainly in, for example, a case like the example we used of the MSR Torman mine area, I mean, in their annual reports, it was pretty obvious what was proposed there, that we're talking about an entire stretch of coast. So even if one doesn't know about all the other activities that are, one of the points made was that the municipality is not always forthcoming, although my sense is that municipalities now are so concerned about the slew of mining applications that they're probably more likely to be amenable to giving any information that EAPS would need. But certainly, at the very least, I think people need to list what those projects are and begin to think about what the potential cumulative impacts might be. I mean, if you've got potentially 7 different parcels of land which could all eventually be mining, and you don't look at the cumulative impact of, for example, the number of trucks on those roads, the amount of dust, the water demand, where water, say, for example, coming from the municipality. I mean, then one is not doing a thorough piece of work. So one understands some of the difficulties, and that some of it is not based on totally accurate and definite information, because some people would argue, well, you don't even know, for example, if those mining rights will actually be actualized, and will they become operational? So now you're perhaps painting a picture of a cumulative impact situation, which is way more than it might be. But at the very least, the public and the decision maker needs to know what's on the table. So I do believe one's got to really try and find that information out, even if the actual assessment part of it might not be as robust as you would like.
Thank you, Merle. That's very practical advice for assistant practitioners out there trying to make sense of it all when their hands are, to some extent, also tied, as you say. The information isn't available. And then specifically in relation to the DMRE, the SAMRAD system that they've supposed to have had operational for I don't know how long, and how many promises we've been made that cadastral program would be up and running, is just it's become a bit of a standing joke. Look, time is running short, and I didn't want to close off without giving everyone an opportunity just to, if you've got any last thoughts, perhaps you don't, that's also okay, but just the last little chip in, perhaps we can go in the order that, I see Dr. Melanie Murcott's got her hand up, so there's probably another question. Melanie, do you want to jump in there quickly before people do a sign off?
Sorry, very quickly. Don't forget we have our book prize of Merle's book to hand out, and I did send through the winning entry through on email. But also, and I'm sorry, I've been a little bit in and out. I wanted to check out, are we saying that interim protection of informal land rights act doesn't apply when prospecting is at play? Was that the conclusion of the discussion, or did I miss something then? And if so, why not? And then I was also wondering if perhaps Nico in his sign-off could give us a little bit of information about Abelobi and what it does. And I think that would be a really wonderful thing for us to hear more about. So thanks very much for a wonderful discussion.
Thanks, Melanie. Melanie's just making sure I'm keeping my I's dotted and my T's crossed. Odette, do you want to jump in there on the Apilra issue in relation to the consent? Just because I think Melanie might have missed a bit of that discussion. Odette, you're on mute.
Yeah, Patrick, I need to think a little bit about the Apilra issue. So I'll just pass on that one.
No problem. Mel, I don't think the discussion wasn't focused around Apilra. It was more about the withdrawal of the recent withdrawal of the notice, the amending the EIA regs as it related to the Ebenezer community. It's particularly, so we weren't commenting on Apilra specifically, but there's so many conflicting issues here at the moment around what constitutes consultation in the context of consent having now been removed. You've got Apilra in the mix as well. I mean, it's a minefield at the moment. But a
literal minefield. I do think if consent has been removed by the EIA rates, the proposed amendments, the consent requirement could still exist in relation to prospecting under Apilra for indigenous communities, and it's definitely something worth looking into. Because I don't see why it would apply for land, but not for this kind of land or this kind of land issue. And it might be stretching it a little bit, but it's worth thinking about.
I think it's definitely worth stretching it a bit if we need to. I think we need every bit of ammunition that we can possibly get our hands on in the face of the onslaught. But just to hand over for final, before we hand over for final goodbyes, I've got to do the book prize. Professor Merle Sowman is the author of a wonderful book which we had chosen to be the prize for a particular person. It was just a competition as registering for today's fun and games, and the prize goes to Mikaya Mugondo, a student at the University of the Western Cape. The book and a free membership for a year to the ELA, which I can vouch as being hugely beneficial, will be communicated through to her in due course. But just from me, just personally, thank you very much for everyone's participation. I'd like to hand over just to the three speakers, just for a final goodbye or just a few words in closing, because I know lots has been discussed tonight. And Nico, please don't forget to give us a little bit of info about Abelobi. So perhaps we can just do it in the order that we started. Merle, if you want to sign off, and then we can go across to Nico and then to Odette. Have we still got Merle, or have we lost Merle? We may have lost Merle, and that may be due to Eskom having implemented load shedding, I think, immediately. Stage 2.
Thanks very much.
No,
yeah, thanks very much for inviting me. I think I'll just hand straight over to Nico. And I enjoyed everyone's contribution. Thank you.
Yeah. Also from me, thank you to everybody. Patrick, Abelobi is a platform whereby we collect data or record catches. It's also a platform that enables to sell to different in home consumers on Abelobi marketplace. I like to call Abelobi it's a digital diary of a future, which he could record, what's happening a day, how much fuel spent, what kind of use, the cost of bait, what kind of code, and for how much he sell his feed. But care about our work, go to our
Nico, I don't know if it's just me, but I think we're having a bit of difficulty hearing you. Very unfortunately, I have put the website in the chat, abelobi.org. I'd encourage everyone to just click on that and have a look and get some information and background around Abelobi. It's a wonderful initiative. Odette, perhaps you want to jump in there just for a quick goodbye.
Yeah, just thank you very much for getting together with the ELA, and I think, certainly there's some great suggestions that came out of this group, and, informal collaboration would really work well, I think. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Odette. Well, then it's just for me to say such gratitude to Merle, to Nico and to Odette for their time. I know it's precious. I know you've got families, you've got lives, you've got pets, you've got everything else that you could be spending your time with rather than us. It really is an absolute pleasure to have you all. I know it's a fight that we all spend every day thinking about, and I hope we all continue. And just as the film opened with a short saying that the film was dedicated to all beings on the West Coast, which I think is really important. It's not just us. There's a whole lot and a whole community living up there that are worth protecting. So thanks for your time, everyone. Have a good rest of your evening.